In the winter of 1860, the children at Blackwood Orphanage started waking up to fresh holes in the yard. Deep ones. 6 feet down, perfectly rectangular, like graves waiting to be filled. No one knew who was digging them until the night they found Thomas Crane's bed empty, his hands covered in dirt and his eyes staring at nothing. 3 nights later, Thomas was gone. Not missing, gone. Because the last hole he dug wasn't empty anymore. The Blackwood Orphanage sat on the edge of Millbrook, Ohio, where the farmland stopped and the woods began. It was a 2-story brick building that housed 43 children, most of them under 12. The place wasn't cruel by the standards of 1860, but it wasn't kind either. The headmaster, Edward Grimsby, ran it like a military camp. Strict schedules, cold meals, and silence after 8 o'clock. Thomas Crane arrived in October. He was 9 years old, skinny, with dark hair that hung in his eyes. His parents died in a house fire that summer. The townspeople said Thomas was the only one who made it out, but he never talked about it. In fact, Thomas barely talked at all. The other children tried to befriend him at first. They asked him questions during meals, invited him to their games in the yard. Thomas would just stare at them with those gray eyes and turn away. After a while, they stopped trying. He became another ghost in a house full of forgotten children. The holes started appearing in mid-November. The first one showed up on a Tuesday morning. One of the older boys, Samuel, spotted it while doing his chores. It was near the oak tree at the edge of the property, about 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and deep enough that Samuel couldn't see the bottom in the early morning light. He told Mr. Grimsby, who assumed it was the work of some animal or maybe a prank by local boys from town. But the second hole appeared 2 nights later, then a third, then a fourth. They were all the same size, all the same depth, all dug with precision that seemed impossible for an animal. Mr. Grimsby inspected them himself, walking from hole to hole with a lantern, his face growing more disturbed with each one. He questioned every child in the orphanage, threatened punishments, even posted a night watch. But the holes kept appearing. It was 11-year-old Margaret who first suspected Thomas. She had the bed next to the window in the girls' dormitory, and she couldn't sleep well. On a Thursday night in late November, she was staring out at the frost-covered yard when she saw movement. A small figure walked slowly across the grass toward the tree line, carrying a shovel. Margaret recognized the walk. Stiff, mechanical, like someone sleepwalking. She watched Thomas for almost an hour. He selected a spot, marked it by dragging his foot in a rectangle, and began to dig. His movements were rhythmic, tireless, and completely silent. Margaret wanted to wake the other girls, but something stopped her. There was something wrong about the way Thomas moved, something that made her stomach twist. When she finally looked away to gather her courage, she glanced back and Thomas was gone. The hole remained, fresh and dark against the pale ground. The next morning, Margaret told Mr. Grimsby everything. The headmaster didn't believe her at first, but when he checked Thomas's bed, he found dirt under the boy's fingernails and caked into the spaces between his toes. Thomas's hands were raw and bleeding, but when Mr. Grimsby confronted him, Thomas just stared with those empty gray eyes and said nothing. Mr. Grimsby locked Thomas in the cellar that night as punishment. He told the other children that the mystery was solved and the digging would stop. But Mr. Grimsby didn't understand what was happening. None of them did, because Thomas didn't dig the holes by choice. The children heard it that night, a scraping sound coming from beneath the orphanage, slow, rhythmic, like nails on wood. It went on for hours. Some of the younger children cried. Others pulled their blankets over their heads and prayed. Margaret sat up in bed, listening, and realized something that made her blood run cold. The scraping wasn't coming from Thomas trying to get out. It was coming from something trying to get in. By morning, the cellar door was open. Thomas stood in the yard, covered in dirt from head to toe, his eyes fixed on a spot near the woods. Mr. Grimsby found him there at dawn, unresponsive, barely breathing. The cellar floor had been torn apart. Chunks of stone and wood were scattered everywhere, and in the center was a hole. A deep one. It went straight down into darkness that the lantern light couldn't reach. Mr. Grimsby sent for the town doctor, who examined Thomas and found nothing physically wrong with him except exhaustion and cuts on his hands. The doctor suggested the boy was experiencing some kind of breakdown from the trauma of losing his parents. He recommended rest and supervision. But that night, Thomas disappeared from his bed again. 3 of the older boys followed him this time, keeping their distance. They watched as Thomas walked to the edge of the property, past all the other holes, to a spot where the grass met the tree line. He didn't have a shovel this time. He just knelt down and started digging with his hands. The boys watched in horror as Thomas dug faster than should have been possible. Dirt flew behind him in sprays. His fingers bled, but he didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. Within an hour, he'd created another perfect rectangular hole, 6 feet deep. Then Thomas climbed inside and lay down. The boys ran to get Mr. Grimsby, who arrived with a lantern and a rope. But when they reached the hole, Thomas wasn't there. The hole was empty except for loose dirt at the bottom. They searched the woods, the yard, the entire orphanage. Thomas Crane was gone. Mr. Grimsby wanted to fill in all the holes and forget the entire incident, but he couldn't. Because 2 nights after Thomas disappeared, the children heard singing. It came from outside, faint and distant, like a lullaby carried on the wind. The melody was unfamiliar, the words in a language none of them recognized. Margaret pressed her face against the window and saw figures standing around the holes. Small figures. Children. They stood perfectly still, one at each hole, their heads bowed like they were praying or waiting for something. Margaret counted them. 11 figures, 11 holes. When the sun rose, the figures were gone, but the holes remained, and now something else had appeared. At the bottom of each hole was a small object. A toy, a shoe, a piece of clothing. Personal items that belonged to children who had lived at the orphanage years before. Children who had died or disappeared and been forgotten. Mr. Grimsby contacted the town sheriff, who brought men with shovels to investigate. They dug deeper into one of the holes, following it down past 6 feet, past 8 feet, past 10. The hole sloped downward at an angle, forming a tunnel that led somewhere beneath the orphanage. The men refused to go further. They filled in that hole and left, telling Mr. Grimsby to contact the church. But it was already too late. If you're enjoying this story, stay with us, because what happens next explains why the Blackwood Orphanage closed its doors in 1861 and why the property remained abandoned for over a century. The children started sleepwalking. First, it was just 1 or 2, then 5, then a dozen. Every night, more children would rise from their beds, walk to the windows, and stare out at the holes with blank expressions. The staff struggled to keep them inside, but the children fought with a strength that seemed impossible. They scratched at doors, broke windows, anything to get outside. Margaret was one of the few who never sleepwalked, and she began to piece together what was happening. She remembered Thomas's arrival, how he said nothing about the fire that killed his parents. She remembered the way he dug those holes with mechanical precision, like he was following instructions only he could hear. Then she remembered something the townspeople had whispered when Thomas first arrived, about how the fire that killed his parents started in the cellar, about how his father had been digging something down there for weeks before the fire, about how neighbors reported hearing singing in a language they didn't recognize coming from the house late at night. Margaret snuck into Mr. Grimsby's office and found the records. Thomas Crane's real name was Thomas Blackwood. His family had built the orphanage 70 years ago. His grandfather, Jonathan Blackwood, had used the property for something else before it became an orphanage. The records didn't say what, but they mentioned a series of disappearances in 1790. Children from the town, 13 in total. The number made Margaret's hands shake. 13 children disappeared, but only 11 holes had been dug. That night, Margaret woke to silence, the kind of silence that feels heavy and wrong. She looked around the dormitory and realized she was alone. Every other bed was empty. She ran downstairs and found Mr. Grimsby in the main hall, slumped against the wall, unconscious. The front door was wide open. Outside, she saw them. All 42 children stood in the yard, forming a circle around the holes. They were singing that same melody, that same unknown language. And at the center of the circle stood Thomas Crane. He looked different now. His eyes glowed with a dim light, and his skin had taken on a gray pallor. He held a shovel, and he was digging 2 more holes. The 12th and 13th. Margaret understood then. The holes weren't graves. They were doorways, passages to wherever Jonathan Blackwood had sent those children in 1790. And Thomas's family had been keepers of those passages, maintaining them, calling to whatever waited below. The fire that killed Thomas's parents hadn't been an accident. It had been an attempt to stop what was coming. But Thomas survived, and the calling passed to him. Margaret ran. She didn't go back for Mr. Grimsby or try to wake the other children. She ran to town and told everyone who would listen. By the time the townspeople arrived at dawn with the sheriff, the orphanage was empty. All 42 children were gone. So was Thomas. The holes remained, now numbering 13 in total, arranged in a perfect circle around the oak tree. At the bottom of each hole was a pile of clothes. The children's nightgowns and sleeping shirts, folded neatly, as if they'd undressed before climbing down into the darkness. The townspeople filled in the holes and burned the orphanage to the ground. The property was declared cursed, and the town tried to forget. But here's what they found in 1952, when developers tried to build on that land. The holes had returned. All 13 of them, empty and waiting, and carved into the oak tree, fresh as if it had been done yesterday, was a message in that same unknown language. The linguist they brought in could only translate 2 words, the last 2 words of the message: still digging.